America, America.
Hello, hello, hello. Hi, Inés.
Hola, dia.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm well. I'm always happy to see you. Every time my spirit's just like, Inés.
I know my soul leaps when I see you. We just have to say hello, and already I'm excited, and nothing has been said or has happened.
I know. It's the exact same. For those listening, this happens every single time I see Inés. Like she's in a room and I'm in a room and I'm just like, so I'm really excited you can be here and we can have this conversation, chat a little bit. It's gonna be
I'm
really
excited
nice.
about what's going to surface from it, and just looking forward to it.
Same, same, same. Well, tell us who you are, all the amazingness that makes up Inez.
I don't know about that, but
I
um,
do. I will say I do.
just a little bit about myself, and hopefully that will even spark some conversation as we continue. My name is Inés Velásquez-McBryde. I am from Nicaragua. I grew up there half of my life, I will say, and I've been in the U.S. for almost 22 years now. I am a pastora, and I'm a third generation pastora. My grandfather
Mm,
was a pastor, my father is a pastor, and I'm the third generation, but first female pastor in my family. I am the co-lead pastor of the church we hope for, which is a church that was planted here in Pasadena during the pandemic. So planting a church during the pandemic felt like having triplets on a roller coaster that was on fire. And only by God's grace and God's spirit were
mhm,
we able to birth a community that I hope continues to be faithful to be a beloved community that is moved by the Spirit to follow the life, love, and justice of Jesus. I'm also a
mhm.
mom of a teenage boy. I am married to Rob. This year, it'll be 19 years that I've been married to Rob. This
Oh,
is amazing.
wow.
And we have a cross cultural marriage that speaks into who I am as well, and a biracial son, and it speaks to who he is as well
Mhm,
as a second generation child born and
mhm,
raised in these United States. And I think that's going to
mhm,
speak into our conversation about your poem called America as well. So
mhm.
that's a little bit about who I am. And if you want to know more, I am sure you'll have questions to ask me later.
Yes, and yes to all
Mm.
the beauty that makes up your life. You've always been someone who comes to mind when I think of the word beloved community. You used that word beloved
Mm.
earlier when you were speaking about the church we hope for, but um, there is something very warm and welcoming about your presence. And I just always
Mm.
think the term pastora could not describe you better, even if you didn't have an official title. Just the
Mm.
tenderness with which you care about people and the way that you embrace people and make room for them, really, and you do have a very natural way of guiding us along our spiritual journey,
Thank
guiding us
you.
along.
Thank you. It must be the abuelita in me. I'm not old enough to be a
Mm.
grandmother, but it must be the abuelita in me that we know that when we step into a room, you and I, Dia, and others as well, we bring our ancestors with us
Oh,
and how
come
we've
on,
been
yes.
raised and how we've been nurtured and how we've been conditioned. We still bring that
Mhm.
into a room, even though I'm standing on this soil here in California. But I bring all my ancestors with me in the room. And in
Mhm.
fact, if you look at my all my art in the back, all my art, most of my art back there is Nicaraguan art because I like
Mhm.
to be surrounded by
Oh,
things that remind me of where I come from. It nourishes my
mhm.
roots. It reminds me who I am, and it centers me when
Mhm.
the world gets too chaotic. It's a place to
Mhm.
return to. And so all my ancestors, my abuelitas, my tias, everybody's with
Mhm.
me in this room.
There, they are
And
here.
so I think you sense all of them as well. So it's not just me,
Mm.
it's all of our people that come with us when we step into a room.
Amen to that. I want to talk about that, but really quickly. I don't want to lose this thread, but
Mhm.
I'm curious about how answer this however you may wish to, but how you've managed to share your heritage with your son. Because you mentioned that he's biracial, and what is it like for him growing up in the United States, but also being aware that he comes from a long lineage of people who aren't necessarily rooted on this particular ground.
Yes, I love that question. And not many people ask me that question. So thank you for thinking about my son, who is my heir, and right now my only heir.
Mm,
From the beginning, since he was in my womb, I spoke to him in Spanish. It is my heart language. And language is connected to memory. Language is connected to land. Language is connected to people, and language carries a history and it's a platform of knowledge. And so from the beginning, speaking to him in Spanish was very important to me so that he would know that he is not just one thing, that none of us really are, and that he carries my ancestors with him. Surrounding him with visuals like my art here, art and language disrupts the patterns of our imagination. And you could probably explain that better, being that you are a visual artist in many ways, also audio artist, but visual artist. Surrounding him with pictures of a landscape of brown women carrying baskets on their heads. All of that is important because it surrounds him. Because this country is going to teach him very quick that he isn't white. And so I have to remind him of his roots, the foods that we eat. This child has been eating black beans since before he could talk, right? So black beans and rice and understanding the history of that. And so when I feed him or when I've told him stories about the food, I am nourishing his roots. So I'm rooting him, and it is my responsibility to root him. Otherwise, the system of whiteness will uproot him, because whiteness was meant to uproot you from one place and to tell you what you are not and what you should be, only one thing. And so food also is very important. The foods that we eat and the stories connected to that food. As he is growing up, I did not grow up here in the US. And so my experience as a first generation Nicaraguan is very different than him. I have even more compassion for second generation Asian American, second generation Indian American, second generation, anything American, right? That born and raised here, but with a further back, with a past. It has been in the school district where he has been not enough of one thing and living in that in-between space. I did not have to grow up with that in the sense that here sometimes he feels like he is not enough Latino or not enough Nicaraguan. For example, he's not fluent in Spanish. And we know why, because a system doesn't support multilingual, and we live in a bilingual home where it's at some point he didn't want to speak Spanish anymore because in the school he was surrounded by English, and Spanish made him feel so different. That really hurt my heart. But I loved a few years ago, two stories connected to that. He asked me, what color is God? One year when he was about 7 years old. And then a couple of years ago, some friends were making fun of him at school because he wasn't brown enough. And they didn't believe he was Latino. And he came home upset. He said, Mom, they don't believe that you're from Nicaragua. They don't believe that I'm Nicaraguan too, because he is lighter skin. He's perhaps more white passing. And it's a sad story because already he was feeling the weight of not being enough, but from a different angle, like not enough brown.
Sure.
But I loved what he did say. He said, I just want to be darker, more like you, which usually it's the opposite. It's like, oh, I need to be lighter in order to survive, in order to make it, in order not to be different. Right. But I thought maybe I've done something right, because he wanted to be darker, and that was a good thing for him. And he wanted to fit in with his friends that are mostly Latino. He is a skateboarder. And once I said, tell your friends to come to the house. I'll talk to them in Spanish. I'll get to know them. And as soon as they saw me, it was like everything changed, because they saw my things here. They said, they told him, oh, your mom has a lot of art from, Latin American art. And they heard me speak in Spanish to them. And then they said, oh, you are one of us. So when you analyze that, you see that we still live in a construct that tells us you're with us or you're not with us or you're not enough. And that has been the hard little thing that I've had to deal with, his little heart, who's trying to figure out, what am I? Who do I belong to? I'm this or I'm that, or I'm not enough from either one. And living in that hyphenated identity has been hard. There's no handbook, and I try to make up things as I go. But when he asked me, what color is God? I didn't have an answer to that question. So you know how they train us in seminary. When you don't have the answer to a question, you answer with another question. I asked him and I said, well, Natch, what color do you think God is? And he
Mm.
said, I think, he said, he's half white and half brown.
Okay. Amen.
And I said, oh, so you think God looks like you? And I said, yes,
Uh,
God looks like you. He's trying to make
mm,
sense of his identity
yeah.
as it pertains to God and as it pertains to himself and as he relates to others. And
Yes.
so it's been a difficult experience at times when he feels like not enough, but it's been a joyful experience to me to root him, to
Mhm.
nourish our roots through food, through art, through language, through taking him to my country as well, to being around our people, for him to be proud of all of
Mm-hmm.
that food, language, color, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
even as he navigates that liminal space in between. It's a little roller
Yeah.
coaster ride.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine, but kudos to you for developing that sense within him, even from the very beginning. I know that, well, I don't know firsthand, I don't have children, but um, I just imagine how difficult it is for parents because this is my, having friends from different cultures. They also struggle at times with their own belonging, right? Their own sense of
Yes.
fitting somewhere. And then how do you begin to offer a sense of belonging to your children if you yourself are also kind of wrestling with it?
Yeah.
This country doesn't always make it very easy to find a place of belonging.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, depending, on what you come with, where where you are. But I do think that that does speak to your essence, Inez, because you are a space maker. We used that word earlier, but I love
Mm.
that it's not just for the broad community, but it's also within your home. You're making space for your son. You make space for your husband, but also want to bring back this part of the conversation too for the
Mm.
ancestors, because I don't know necessarily that they commune as easily with others as they do with you.
Mm.
I feel as though you are open to the presence of others and open to the needs of others within a space that allows the needs to come up and to be nurtured. I do think that's something that you do quite naturally.
Mm.
I would like to
Yes.
ask this question about ancestry, though. How did you begin to use this language? I don't think it's that common. And it just rolls off your tongue. The ancestors are in the room with me. I bring them into the room. Where did that come from? Because some people even might react to that and be like, "Oh, I feel something when she says that, but I don't quite know what to make of it." You know?
Yes. I believe that I felt that language before I knew that I had language to
Mm-hmm.
say it out loud. And I try to say as much as possible because I get the reaction that you just got. And I
Mm-hmm.
hear this often. But
Mm-hmm.
I believe that I learned to do this through storytelling. Nicaragua is an oral storytelling culture. Most Latin American, most collectivistic cultures are.
Mm-hmm.
And what I remember is my abuela, my abuelita, my grandmother, my tias telling stories of their moms and their tias. And through
Mm-hmm.
storytelling, you hear how we came to be, how
Mm-hmm.
this rice is important, how this rice was made. Oh, this rice, your grandmother did it like this, so you must do it like this. It must be 1.5 cups of water per 1 cup of
Mm-hmm.
rice. And so you're carrying down, you're
Mm-hmm.
passing down tradition, you're passing down stories, you're passing down ways of being, ways of seeing the world. And through that, I realized, oh, my ancestors are always with me. When I make this rice, I always make it 1 cup of rice, 1.5 cup of water, and I have to wash the rice 3 times. My
Mm-hmm.
grandmother taught me that because her mother taught her that, because her mother taught her that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started seeing more and more, especially as I was trying to root myself in this country as an immigrant. I needed to go back to what was home to remember and to not forget. And then also, I saw that in the Bible. Like when I look at the
Mm-hmm.
genealogy of Jesus, why did the Holy Spirit think it was important to show the genealogy of Jesus, to show that there were 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus, to show that there were 3 foreigners in the genealogy of Jesus, scandalous women? And I saw the importance of
Mm-hmm.
passing down stories and passing down memories, passing down language. And so I started saying that more and more, especially because I am not self made. I bring everyone with
Mm-hmm.
me. I everyone. that has made me who I am. And forgetfulness is not something that is helpful, especially as we lived in a racialized society. We need to
Mhm.
remember where we are from, because we're not from nowhere. We are from somewhere, and we carry our
Good.
people with us. And so that's a way also to have a collectivistic culture, to bring my ancestors
Mhm.
with me and to remember how they passed down good things, healing things, wisdom,
Mhm.
from the older to the young. And I hope that you
Mhm.
and I become ancestors too one day to somebody else.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be biological children, but that our communities are receiving that collectivistic wisdom.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I know that you and Bobby's definitely, Bobby is Inez's co-pastor at the church we hope for. I know that you center story quite intentionally. And I'm assuming part of that is for that very reason, so that there can be a sort of collective memory built up of who's in the room with us and like who are we together, and where have we each come from and what are we bringing into the space together. And then from there, how do we venture forward in service of the Lord and caring for one another, you know? I do know that you sent her story. I'm
Absolutely.
curious also, yeah, I'm curious also about, I'm going to use this word quite intentionally, but I think of um, the sense of homemaking. And the reason why I use that is because, and I don't just mean like our
Mm.
literal, like where we're residing, I mean the
Mm-hmm.
sense of making a space where people can come into themselves and be, you know, where they get to
Mm.
rest, where they get to play, where they get to be at ease and know that those within the space, hopefully those who are in the space with them, are receptive of whomever it is that they are and what they're bringing to the
Mm.
table. How have you gone about homemaking in that broad sense? Because you do this. Um, I see you do it everywhere you go. You know, everywhere you go, and it may just be that it's
Mm.
part of your essence, but I do think there's something that those who don't have that quality as innately as you do, I do
Mm.
believe that there's something to be gleaned from how you go about seeing the world. And why are you so intentional about making a home for people to come into?
Mm.
What is that
Mm.
about?
Wow, what a great, thoughtful question, Dia. Let me think about that. And even as you were speaking, some things came to mind. I think again, here again, is bringing the wisdom of my ancestors. My abuelita had a saying in Spanish whenever she invited people to the house and there was not enough to eat. For example, she would say,
Mm,
"Donde comen dos, comen tres." Wherever two eat, three can eat. Like we can always make a little
mm,
more room. You could just divide that up a little bit more. And again, I remember a lot of stories of my abuelita saying during the war, we didn't have enough food. And so we had to make do, we had to multiply. So my abuelita was multiplying that, was utilizing that multiplying power that Jesus had to feed the 15,000. Because when you include women
mm-hmm.
and children, that's a more gender inclusive number.
Right.
15,000. You made home for
Yes.
15,000. You made food for 15,000.
Mm,
That was the abuelita that I had. Or when it
mm,
comes to my black bean soup, which I joke about all the time, it's my only evangelistic tool. My black bean soup is my evangelistic tool in this church. She would say, or my mother would also say, and it's a saying in Nicaragua, if somebody comes unannounced to the house and you don't know that they were coming, you would not turn them away because that would be inhospitable. You would welcome them and just add more water to the soup. Just ponle más agua a la sopa. And
mm,
so that refrain of like, ponle más agua a la sopa, add more water to the soup, is a whole way of thinking of how to make someone feel at home, not feel awkward because they came unannounced or because there's not enough food in the house, but you're going to make do. You're going to make space. You're going to somehow multiply,
mm,
add more water to the soup. And it's kind of like a joke, but you can add more broth to the soup. You can multiply
mm.
and make room. And
Absolutely.
within that way of thinking of including, you make people feel safe, you make people belong, you provide for their needs. Because if they're hungry, you're going to make way to provide for
Mm,
them. And so I think, yes, that innate sense that I grew up with just very naturally comes into all the spaces where I am. I can be at a coffee shop, I can be in a seminary room, with you
mhm,
in a classroom,
mhm,
or I can be creating a church where we want this ecosystem to also
mhm,
be very inclusive, to say, we got 2 plates, but we need a third plate. We're going to make do because you have a need. And if it's your need, then it's also my need and it's also my responsibility. And that's within this larger collective mentality of we need to care for each other. We have to care for each other. The brother or the sister knocking on the door, if they don't have something, then it's my responsibility to figure out how to provide. And then the larger arc of that is the sense of justicia. So the word righteousness in our English Bibles, there's 2 words for righteousness, mishpat and tzedek in the Old Testament. But in Spanish, we have one translation for those 2 words. One is more like a personal piety, righteousness, and the other one is more like justice and outside oriented. But in Spanish, it's just justicia. When you grow up hearing justicia, justicia, when you seek God, the kingdom of God and God's justicia, it's less individualistic and it's more collectivistic, always thinking of the other. So that shapes the language in which I read my Bible being Spanish, and the language and the world behind justicia shapes how I'm always other oriented. I have to be careful of that because I can go overcorrect there and never take care of myself. But that's the immigrant mentality too. Like, we're not going to make it to the other side unless we go together. We're not going to make it to the other side. And if I have a little, even if I have a little, out of 2 plates, I can make 3. If I got this much soup and more people come, I just add more water. So it's a way of being and seeing the world. And I guess it is homemaking. And I like that thought. I like that thought of thinking that when someone is in my presence, whether it's my home or our church, that they feel safe at home and that their needs could be met. Not probably perfectly every need, but that they would feel safe enough that in this place their needs could be met, whether it's their soul or the needs of their bodies connected to their soul, So I love the idea that you asked, how do we create a place where it's home, where we can rest, where we can play, where we can be at ease and not be afraid.
Yes, not be afraid. And then also to not be afraid to express the needs. Someone may have a need but feel as though they can't bring it forward, making a space where people can say, I actually, in order for me to be fully myself and to be able to be whole in this space, I actually need this. And is this space accommodating enough for me to be and to present that before you without judgment, Can I bring that forward as well?
And in a multi-ethnic community, that is a challenge because at the core, we all have maybe similar needs, but those needs are expressed differently. Those needs are expressed in what foods do we eat? What stories do we center? What images do we use if they're only one kind? So in a multi-ethnic community, it is even more necessary to say, oh, I need to sing in Spanish. Like my body needs it, right? Or I need to see just because I'm a woman of color doesn't mean I represent all women of color. I can even represent all Nicaraguan women. And so to say, for example, I need to sit at the leadership and I'm reading an Asian American theologian right now. I need to keep learning about what my other familia needs because I'm a woman of color, but I'm not Asian or Asian American heritage. Right. And I need to understand what is that need? What could they not be getting here that might impact their sense of belonging or their sense of identity? And so that's an added challenge in a multi-ethnic community. And so I'm constantly wanting to be an ongoing learner and sit at the feet of others who are teaching me. Because to be a multi-ethnic pastor means that you can't be all things, but you need to learn. You need to be on your way. And there's certainly some communities that I know more about and other less of. And so, I reading Asian American theologian right now. I should say her name. Her name is Dr. Cindy Lee. And I'm reading a book about spiritual formation that is de-Westernized, that the center is Taiwan, her Taiwanese heritage, and it is blessing my socks off. I need her. And I'm going to Manzanar for the second time for a pilgrimage to go touch the land and stand on the land and hear the history of Japanese and Japanese American incarceration unjustly. I need to do that again. Just because I did it one time, I didn't check it off my list. I need to take my body there again. And so that too is homemaking, because I'm expanding my idea of there's not just one way to create home. And so in order for me to be a multi-ethnic pastor to a pan-Asian community,
Mhm.
I need to go put my body in places that make me uncomfortable, and keep learning from those communities as well, as we center those stories as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. A couple of things come to mind. I'm like, don't lose the thoughts. Keep
I
them.
know we could talk forever about all the things.
It's so true, though. It's so true. They can go in a lot of different directions. Just something that I feel like is important for listeners, because you do this type of, I don't want to call it work. I don't even want to use the word ministry, because you enact this type of care towards people quite naturally. I don't
Mm,
want to gloss over it as though it is easy for everyone to assume the
mm,
same posture.
mm,
So, what you said about, if someone, the phrasing that you have was quite beautiful. So, forgive me for remixing it. I don't necessarily intend to, but you said that if someone is hungry, we're going to feed them, something along those lines. And
mm,
that mentality of assuming someone's burden
mm,
is not necessarily a habit that I think everybody has. I think that,
mm,
a lot of pastors have, this is what makes them a pastor, right? But even beyond that, I feel as though we're in a cultural moment in which we must cultivate that. We must weave in that element of care for the other person if we are to survive as a culture and not tear ourselves apart, right? And I feel as though we're in a phase in time in which, um, it can be quite difficult to remember how to do this. I find that people express the desire. They want to care about the quote unquote other. They want to care about someone who's different than they are.
mm,
But the question is, how do I do it? Or
mm,
if I feel, is it my own discomfort something to consider? Like, how do I cultivate that heartbeat that says someone is hungry and I don't perceive of a way to multiply what I have without like messing up my own ecosystem? How
mm,
then do I begin to invite another into the fold? Because I feel as though, maybe the desire is there,
mm,
but the question of how to go about it is not. But I love what you said, because you said
mm,
it's not just about what's right in front of you, it's about, not looking at it in a closed way, in the sense that this is all that we have and we can do no more. There's always this,
mhm,
um, I love the term divine grace embedded within what we have
mm,
when we begin to ask, how can we stretch and multiply? And that's the question, right? It's not always about what we can add to the mix, but how can we, pour in the water, right? And I
mm.
hope you know where like my spirit moves
Yeah.
with that, in terms of like,
Mhm.
asking God to step in and being like, we need you to multiply what we have because the need is greater than we anticipated, you
Yeah.
know? And I don't want to gloss over that, because I feel as though what you brought in with your ancestors and the capacity that you gained from your grandmother, your abuelita, your tias, what
Mhm.
you gained from them, is not the same sort of learning that a lot of people in this country have, you know?
Right.
So I don't want to miss it. I want to highlight
Mm.
that.
Thank you for pausing there. Thank you for pausing, because I think those abuelitas, those tias, and probably in your family, you can find those ancestors as well. We're walking in the tradition of the leadership of Mother Mary. The first
Mm,
miracle in the Gospel of John, it is a woman who says there is a need. When she says there's no more wine, she ain't just talking about there's no thing to party about. Or
come
I
on.
love that she is concerned about the wine. But if you look into that, you can also see that some people,
Mm,
it could be man or woman, but we're following her leadership, note when there's scarcity, note when there's need, and she anticipates that need and wants to do something
right.
about it. And then
Mm,
she doesn't just see the need, she says, I'm going to do something about it. I know who can take care of this. So she goes
yes.
to her son and says, I need you to multiply this wine, this water.
Mm,
There's no more wine.
mhm,
And then she sends the servants to go fill up with Jesus. They're co-creating together. So I love your question, and then I also want to add that there's mutuality,
mhm,
co-creation, and reciprocity. That it's not all on one of us to anticipate a need, because it would be impossible, because I don't know what I don't know. And especially about in a multi-ethnic community, you don't know what the specific needs
mhm,
are and how they can be approached. And so to be like Mary and to say, there's no more wine, I see that there's a need. Another question that has helped me for it to be mutual and for there to be reciprocity is to ask someone, especially from collectivistic cultures, especially from immigrant communities that we're used to giving and taking care of others. We have a hard time asking for help ourselves. I have a hard time asking for my own help. I've learned to ask the question, what do you need from me? And for a collectivistic person, for an immigrant culture, for an eldest daughter of 7 children, it sometimes I can't even say in Spanish nor in English. It is really hard for me to say, what do you need from me? And then not only that, for me to say back what I actually need. I have very few people who ask me on a regular basis, what do you need today? What does Inés need today? What does Inés want today? So we must do that also in our sense of collective responsibility, to ask God's wisdom to see so that our eyes can be open and so our ears can be open, because the opposite of justice is not injustice, it's indifference. So God help me to not be indifferent. So help me to see how the Japanese incarceration camps still continue to make my Asian American sisters and brothers, just in general, hyper invisible. God help me to see how they're being invisible. And then also help me have the humility to ask, what do you need from me? So that someone else has the dignity of telling you what they need. So that also we don't assume what somebody else needs.
Yes.
Because that solution may look different than what you and I would do for our family of origin or our culture or our neighborhood, whatever it is. But to give someone else the dignity and the self-advocacy to say, this is what I need. That's the other half of the job that's really, really hard for us to express need. I say that because it's hard for me to say, this is what I need, or I need this, and then tangible, right? So I wonder what it would look like on a case-by-case basis, on an ecosystem, in the home, in the church ecosystem, for us to be able to create an ecosystem where there's reciprocity and mutuality, and we don't assume that we know what a community needs, that we assume that we know what a people need, that we can also ask questions and say, what do you need from me? And that's a humbling question too, because the answer may surprise you, and it may not be what you would have thought. And there's humility in that as well.
Absolutely.
Because marginalized people, I don't like when they're described as, we are voiceless. We're not voiceless.
Right?
We have a voice.
So much,
it's just that we've been either silenced or unheard. And so give someone the gift of their voice.
Yes.
They can tell you what they need. It may not be the way you approach it. That is totally okay. We're not just one thing. So reciprocity, mutuality, co-creation. We're creating together a solution. And that's a way to decolonize even our own formation and our own solution to the problems that oppress us. Mutuality.
This term co-creation really pops out for me because what's the passage where Paul says, I have become all things to all people? Sometimes I cringe when I hear that, because it depends on where you are on the spectrum. If you're the kind of person who needs to give more of yourself to others, sure, let that phrase inspire you. But if you're the kind of person who is doing a little bit too much and forgetting about self, you might need to,
absolutely.
Makes me cringe a little bit, I'm like, I don't know. Because some of us have made a job out of doing for others without also, tending to self, which is quite detrimental as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Our doing should flow from our being. But because we have seen a historical church that either has been just navel gazing and just thought about their souls without how the bodies are doing connected to those souls, so then we overcorrect and we do more than we're taking care of our inner selves, as an overcorrection for those who've just thinking about their souls but never do anything for their bodies or take care of the bodies that are out on the streets. And so balance and co-creation with a spirit that cares about yes and theology. Yes, we need to care for our souls, and yes, we need to care for our bodies, and they're not binary. They're not binary, but the church has separated that and made it binary, as if one is more important than the other. But Jesus often pushed away the crowds and said, I can't deal with you people no more. I'm going to go be by myself. Up in the mountain, I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you.
Mhm.
Don't want to see the disciples. He went and took care of himself. He grieved when his cousin with his primo was killed. He went to be with his God to cry and lament and weep. And out of that, miracles came. Miracles came.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tending to self and to others and finding the capacity to do that. Um, there's so much I want to dive into. I'm trying to like focus our conversation. But I just have certain thoughts just sort of echoing in my mind. But let's turn the conversation over to sort of macro lens. We are going to talk a little bit about America on the AP, but I want to come at that from a very broad landscape now that we've kind of surveyed where we are locally, you know, how you do what you do in your daily relationships, and the spaces that you create with the people that you are communing with. But you started your story speaking about something much broader, you know. And so I want to talk about this broader aspect of um, this idea of America, and I'm very intentional of calling it an idea as opposed to just a place.
Yes.
Um, when you, because you said second generation, right? So I'm curious about how your concept of America has changed, has morphed, has grown over the years, like from when you were a child to the magnificent woman that you are now. What's that journey been like to try to wrap your mind around America?
What a wonderful question. And I listened to your poem/song twice titled America on the Black Halos podcast. And I was fascinating. I wanted to hear every sound, every breath, every word that you were saying. All of it was bringing up things in my body. And so this is what came up after listening to your poem and your words and the music. When I think of America, I think of a continent, not a country.
Mm-hmm.
And so that informs my sense of America. And I do like that you call it an idea, because it's an idea and a myth. However, there are
Mm-hmm.
some tangible things that we can touch
Very
upon
much
to
so.
say, well, this is what it has been. So when I grew up in the school system, we learned that there are 5 continents. Now I know that in the US, you learn that there's 7 continents, but I learned that there are 5 continents: America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the ocean. So there's
Okay.
only 5. And so it's still like putting people in lands that are very different from each other in chunks, but it's a different chunk. And so when I think of America, I think of a whole continent and not just a solo country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I grew up thinking about America, because to me it was North, Central, and South. And that within the continent of America, there's 21 countries that speak Spanish, but not every Latin American country speaks Spanish. Brazil speaks Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
Nicaragua. So let's go from the macro to the micro. In Nicaragua alone, we speak Spanish as a predominant language. We also speak Miskito, Sumo, and Rama.
Mm-hmm.
Miskito, Sumo, and Rama are West African languages. So, sister, if I took you to the East Coast in Nicaragua and you didn't say a word, okay, so they wouldn't hear your English accent. Well, if you just didn't say a word, you could walk down the street and someone could think you're a Black Nicaraguan.
Wow.
That is my America. That is my Central America. That is my East Coast of Nicaragua America. An America that has a history. Why are there 3 West African languages in the East Coast of
Mm-hmm.
Nicaragua? Why? Because slave ships brought
Mm-hmm.
our Black sisters and brothers who now speak Miskito, Sumo, Rama, and some form of Creole that mixes English and Spanish, and is
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. And so even when I think of Nicaragua, there's not one language. There's not one color. Like, there's all ranges from lighter than me to darker than you. And we're all Nicaraguan, right? So
Mm-hmm.
to think of America as a continent, not just a solo country, is a different construct than what I bumped up against. When I moved here as an immigrant, I was like, oh no, when they say America, they don't mean the same thing. They're
Mm-hmm.
appropriating one word to like exclude everybody else that lives on this continent Whereas the name of this country is United States of America, meaning
Mm-hmm.
there's a larger
Come on.
whole, right?
Yes.
Like a chapter in the whole book. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
chapter in the whole book. But the way it's used, it's like, no, it's only ours and it's only one kind and it looks like one person,
Yeah. Yeah.
predominantly white male, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a shock for me when I came to the
Mm-hmm.
US to see that we didn't mean the same thing when we said America, because to me it was a continent. And so therefore it's a land, and so therefore it's multiple languages, and so therefore it's multiple people. And then you have the history of, European ancestors coming to colonize our lands and violate our people and steal our riches,
Mm-hmm.
our meaning like the collective land, stolen lands, displaced peoples. That too is America. Which means that when land, language, and peoples get displaced, then identities get displaced.
Mm-hmm.
Then a sense of belonging gets displaced. So when I moved to the US as an 18-year-old, I was shocked with that we didn't all mean the same thing when we said America. And that now I didn't just cross the border, the border had crossed over me.
Mm-hmm.
The border had gone over me. I lived in Texas for 5 years, and now I've lived in California for 6 years. And it's really interesting how the borderland region of places, of any place, but really of the US, gives you an added layer of who is America and whose America.
Mm-hmm.
Who is America? So when I lived in Texas, I just moved here from Nicaragua. I was going to a predominantly white church. I was in a college group, and I was really afraid to pray out loud because I couldn't pray in English. I had only just prayed in Spanish all my life. So the first time that I was super bashful back then. First time that I decided to pray out loud in a group. We were on a mission trip in South Padre Island, of all places. I started praying in Spanish. And after our team finished praying, we were about to go, evangelize on the streets. This young man grew up in Texas, happened to be white, happened to be male, came to me and said, I don't think you need to pray in Spanish anymore because you're breaking the unity of our group because we can't understand what you're saying. And I was just shocked at what he said to me. And I
Oh,
left the
man.
room and cried. I didn't know what it was
Yeah.
doing to my body.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt so sad. If I were to go
Mm-hmm.
back to that moment, knowing what I know now, and anybody would say that to me now, I would say, I wasn't talking to you. I can.
Exactly. This is
I
our
wasn't talking to you.
conversation.
It's not,
That has
you're not in this conversation,
precisely.
However, but you take that line and you
Mm-hmm.
realize that that line is ensconced in the land of Texas, which is a borderland region.
Yeah.
Whose land did that used to be? Just like
Mm-hmm.
California, whose land did this used to be that we're standing
Come
on
on.
right now? Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that line is a whole mentality, has a whole line and lineage of racism and
Mm-hmm.
oppressive ideologies that wanted to conquer land, language, and peoples. So when someone is telling me you shouldn't pray in your own heart language, it is an old line. It is a
Absolutely.
historically racist,
Mm-hmm.
dehumanizing line. Because if you study that line and that phrase where it's being said,
Mm-hmm.
that's the land that put indigenous siblings in reservation camps, that put indigenous children in boarding schools
Yeah.
to beat the Indian out of them.
Yeah.
These are the
Yeah.
things, the ideologies, which are demonic and oppressive and dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm.
It's that same ideology that would tell someone don't speak Spanish. I had a lot to learn as an older immigrant. I had a lot to learn when I moved here as an older immigrant to the US, because I had to quickly realize that there was a Hispanic narrative already happening here, and I was just being
Mm-hmm.
grafted into it. I need to catch up. Homegirl here had to catch up to understand the
Mm-hmm.
oppressive systems that had oppressed my siblings. So to hear, my friends, my Texan friends, parents or grandparents say, "Oh yeah, we used to get beat if we spoke Spanish in school. We used to get put in detention. We had to,
Mm-hmm.
our hands got slapped if we spoke Spanish." And I thought, "Oh my goodness." So when a second generation child doesn't know Spanish or doesn't know it well, I have to think back to that. That's the ideology that still infects and affects systems now. The school system, the government, the neighborhoods, who can swim. My neighbor told me last year that here in Monrovia, the YMCA, just decades ago, Mexicans could only swim on Wednesdays, and the pool had to be, cleaned for the next day.
That's what I thought you were going to
That's a
say. Wow.
history.
Okay.
That's a history. And so the borderland regions like Texas, where I've lived, like California, where I lived, give us an added layer of who is America, who is considered American. And the idea, I like that you say the idea and the myth of a monolith, that America is not a monolith. Nicaragua is not a monolith. So if my small, tiny country of Nicaragua is not a monolith, of course, the U.S. is not even going to be that. And so to understand the history is to understand who is America now. And to me, it's still a continent. I try to, even though here, all the language that I hear, I correct it in my brain. If I hear someone say, "Oh, were they American?" I was like, "Well, what kind of American?"
Yes.
What do you mean when you say American? You mean like U.S. American, like white American, what English speaking American, which American? And so I try to remember that if I think of it as a continent, it is more expansive, more generous, more generative, more colorful. And it's not the monolith of the myth of America that you and I are constantly fighting against with our language, with our bodies, with our way of being, with our sense of time. So many things, right? We hit that monolith, that myth all the time, and we have to fight it. So I didn't cross the border. The border crossed me, and therefore told me I'm on the outside. And so borders and borderland regions, I'm very attentive to those. I'm very tender to those places and how they have shaped the idea of the myth of America.
Yes. First off, I roll to that person.
I roll.
I just can't believe somebody actually came up to you and said, "Don't speak in your your heart language, or don't pray in your heart language," because the rest of us don't know what you're saying. Well, how about you learn a thing or two? Oh my gosh, it's just, I just kind of cringe. Of course, we were talking about language earlier, but I just think about, because you're talking about the need to push back against the sort of dominant narrative that's at play. And I just think about the way that our language continues to entrench certain ideals in our minds, our collective mind, if you will. Of course, the term all American comes to mind. There's a very specific image when you think about who is an all American, very particular. And I feel very comfortable saying that the majority of us, when we think about all American, come up with a very similar
Yeah.
image. And that's the
Yes.
thing, right? Like, that's the essence. Why is that the emblem of all of America, right? Um, yes. I, I'm still curious also about, um, because while you were learning, having to learn what those on this particular continent consider America to be, you also had to probably have done some unlearning as well for you to do the kind of work and ministry that you do. So where did that, I won't call it a single turning point, because I believe that we accumulate these sorts of knowledges and awareness about what's actually happening on the ground with which we stand. I think that happens over time for most of us. But when did you begin to reclaim your heritage, if that's the word you want to use? Did you never lose it? Did you always continue to put it forward, and the reason why I'm asking this is because I do feel as though there are some who might be listening who could find themselves in a transition phase where they sort of have some choices to make. Do I try to blend in, try to become something I'm not in order to be accepted within whatever the community or whole or workforce, whatever it might be, is telling me I need to become? Other people might be on the other side where they're saying, I'm all of me, and this is who I am, take it or leave it. But I think that people are trying to navigate this, trying to be self, trying to be whole, also trying to find a place of belonging. Trying, if
Mm.
you love a job but you don't like people that you work with, it's difficult because they don't receive you. That's a very difficult place to be. You know, if you are second, third, fourth generation,
Mm.
and maybe you have people in your family who remember what it was like in their time to be in a different place. Do I blend in with my family? Do I take that with me? Or do I try to be like my friends? You know, that we were talking about your son and the sort of tension that he was feeling. I think that's very real for a lot of people. Most of us don't come from just one place anymore.
Yeah.
There are a lot of immigrants in this country, you know, and the idea that everybody has the same sense of belonging is ridiculous, you know. And so I feel as though there's something that people can glean from your experiences. You know, like how did you begin to shape the idea, the concept of belonging and of being an American today? You know, having gone through the journey that you went through.
Thank you for asking that question. It invites me to go back to my story and to remember even why I moved here to the US.
Mm-hmm.
When I moved here to the US, I came on an academic scholarship, and I believed implicitly, I wouldn't have said that then, but I believe now implicitly that white was better. White
Mm-hmm.
education, white
Mm-hmm.
books, white authors, a white way of being, a white church. And so I came
Mm-hmm.
thinking, oh, you know, the system of whiteness has created something better. And when I lived in Texas, I did not realizing that I was immersing myself in that sort of ideology of whiteness. And it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
until Latin American studies, Latin American literature was my minor, and then it became my major. And it was by reclaiming my poetry, by reclaiming my literature, by joining a predominantly Mexican American sorority in college that showed me, oh, wait a minute, I've been lied to. I
Mm-hmm.
somehow think that my way of being might be less. Do you know what I'm saying? But you don't realize that. You're thinking, I'm just going to the US to study.
Yeah.
But I had
Mm-hmm.
believed an implicit lie, right? And because I lived in Texas and my proximity with Mexican Americans who knew their oppression and whose oppression I was learning about, especially because of the borderland region, that propelled me into a crisis of, oh my goodness, who who do I think that I am?
Mm-hmm.
That this thinking that this other way is better. Like what I have and what my people bring is rich. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was through my Mexican American sisters in that sorority that I learned more and more the implicit bias that we were all swimming in the myth of America as a country, right? And then I moved to Arkansas, where I had to learn the history of that land, so the black white binary. And it was through being in college there, finished my college there, learning the history of it being a lynching state, learning about Silas Hunt, who was the first African American to integrate the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And so then seeing how systemic racism was a system that had infected all of life. So my experience in Texas and Arkansas, through being educated there, showed me the construct of race as a construct and how it had
Mm-hmm.
infected this country from its inception, from understanding the history of slavery as an institution, how it even
Mm-hmm.
strengthened the Constitution, that it was cemented in the foundations of this country and therefore affected every system that birthed from it.
Yeah.
And in so doing, I was having to like grasp at something to feel like I was still me. And so I think in that experience, that's where I started grabbing a hold of my ancestors, calling out their name, remembering where I was coming from, knowing that the brown church and the brown people were a gift to this
Mm-hmm.
country, even as I was feeling the tension of racist names that we were being called to me, being asked not to pray in my heart language. Like that was just shocking to
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah.
And seeing the more overt racism towards African Americans, towards my Latino sisters, towards Asian Americans as well. And so that was a whole unlearning, but it was very
Mm-hmm.
disorienting to not know how to navigate. navigate the system. And it required that I learn history. I had to hit the history books. I had to learn the history of this land and to see myself as one that was grafted in you know, the racist ways that this country was built on, and even more, not seeing my Native American brothers until later in the conversation, not seeing how their indigenous lands had been stolen and taken, and then reading that history as well. I knew my Nicaraguan history, but I didn't know this history, and racism and sexism shape shifts through history. So I had to learn the shape of it here, which might have looked a little bit different than in Nicaragua. It wasn't until someone asked me if I was Cherokee, and I said, no. Someone came to me at church one day and said, "Are you Cherokee?" And I said, "No, I'm Inez." And I didn't know they were asking me about my perceived ethnicity or race. So some things I was clueless about, and I had to do some catching up by learning history. And so through the work of being on staff at churches that were systemically racist, I had to do a lot of unlearning, and even myself do my own inner work, even as a person of color, to say, oh my goodness, what implicit racism do I have? What implicit sexism do I have? What's my internalized oppression that I need to undo and then create something new, because I could no longer unsee the waters that we were swimming in. And so, especially as I marry someone who is a U.S. American, especially as I have a biracial son, I've had to dig deeper into reclaiming food, reclaiming language, reclaiming literature, reclaiming art, to remember and nourish my roots. I don't know if that answers your question. That's what comes to mind, because it is a journey. It is a journey, and for everybody is different.
It is. It definitely answers the question, and I just want to pull out certain elements just to highlight them. But what I hear you saying several times now is this idea of intentionally learning the history about the place where you are physically located. And I think this is important because I know a lot of times people, we can just say people are busy, or they don't want to look at that thing, maybe it feels a little bit too heavy. But in order to understand how we have all collectively been grafted into something, we, like you said earlier, we don't come from nowhere. We each come from somewhere, and collectively we each have history that ties us to one another and to the land itself and to our ancestors. And there really is no way, in my opinion, to become the wholest version of ourselves if we have not yet pieced together what was broken from the past. And when I hear you talking about learning the history, I always think that is the best place for someone to begin. What happened in my actual neighborhood before the development of the home that I'm in? Who
That's
was
right.
here? What's the story? And it just begins to open up your eyes. But another point that I really want to highlight, because I think this is really crucial, it's actually, I have my own version of this story as well. Let me talk about Black Halos really quickly. So Black Halos started off as a performance art piece before it became like the exhibition and the EP. And in that performance, I talk about a very similar story of needing to uh, uh, break away from white-centered thought, in the sense that I love this term that you use about being grafted in, because it's this sense of something has pulled me along without me necessarily being aware, right? And so this is the point I want to make, though, is that a lot of times for those of us who are on the journey of discovering what whiteness is, and having our eyes open basically to the actual history and how we've become implicated within like its workings and its doings, right? When we're talking about whiteness, I think it's essential to understand that the point is not to get stuck in a sense of shame, or not to get stuck in a sense of I think like this, therefore I am X, Y, and Z. The point is to have your eyes open, and then with new information, make different choices, in my opinion. And I say this because I had a very similar journey, in the sense of like growing up in predominantly white spaces, mainly suburban. Most of the kids are fairly well-to-do. Most of them are white. And what you grow up with then is this idea that for white kids, white way of being is the right way to do it. Because if I go outside of that, and I see people of color struggling, oh, well, then there must be something wrong with what they're doing, right? It's not
Right.
about the system. At the time, you don't know this. It's not about the system. It's about the people. So something's wrong with the people. Therefore, your whiteness is like, that's the way to go, right? And
Yeah.
then, growing up and honestly, just literally honestly following the Holy Spirit's guidance and needing to put my body in places that allowed me to be around people who were different, who could then broaden my worldview and even my own self-view, right? As a Black woman, it wasn't until I had graduated high school or graduated college and following God's guidance, I went to New York City. I didn't want to be there. I was like, I don't want to go to New York. But I felt like God saying, this is actually where I want you to go. And I went, and God did so much within my spirit during that time.
Wow.
I'm in a Black ministry, in a Black church where I'm surrounded by Blackness in a way that I haven't experienced it, like outside of just my family dynamic. And that's forcing me to question why I think the way that I think. And even before that, to discover what my thoughts actually are. Because a lot of times we have our ways of thinking, but they're not always conscious. We're not intentionally
Yes.
thinking, I want
That's
to go
it.
the right way. It's just that it's just below the surface, coloring all of our decisions. And then when you finally stop to say, here's the actual thought, where did that thought come from? Why do I think the way that I do? That's
Yeah.
when the healing begins to take place. And the point again is not to get stuck in the fact that you were grafted in, or not to get stuck in the sense that this
Right.
system, this water that we're swimming in exists. Don't get stuck there, become aware of
Yeah.
it. But then it's to say, okay, those were the choices I had when I was unconscious. And now I want to move in a different direction. Now I want to begin to understand where do my people come from, and to
Yeah.
not be ashamed of the history. I love what you said about how your people, the culture is rich, there's
It
a
is
vibrancy,
rich.
a colorfulness, there's energy, and to not to be ashamed of the history. Like, why would you be ashamed of something that has been so life-giving for centuries, pre this
Yes.
sort of modern era that we find ourselves living in? People were
Yes.
thriving in their cultures, they were enjoying their culture with one another, enjoying their food and their music and their ways of dress. Like, that was what they took pride in. I think about like tribal wars and tribalism. That comes from a sense of pride, as like awful as war is, but that comes from a sense of like, I love who we are as a people, and I'm willing to defend it
Right.
as well. Not condoning violence or war in
Right.
any sort of form
Right.
or fashion, but just saying, I feel as though people had a sense of energy, excitement, like pride about their heritage.
Amen.
Their stories. Like, I come from this place. I'm from these people, and we feel good about us. And I just think about what colonialism stripped stripped from those of us who don't come from this land, which is actually the majority of us,
Right.
and those of us who identify
Absolutely.
as people of color.
Exactly. Absolutely. I love what you're saying, that we have to, what I hear you saying, the way it hits my body is that we have to be self-compassionate and
Mm-hmm.
self-loving and welcome this unlearning without shame, because
Mm-hmm.
nobody, first of all, nobody stands on moral ground, but second,
Mm-hmm.
nobody is untainted by the system of whiteness. And so the
Exactly.
work that we must
Exactly.
do as people of color is to unlearn the way that it has internally and unconsciously, that's the thing, unconsciously oppressed
Mm-hmm.
us. And I was still learning 6 years ago when I first came to Fuller Seminary, which is when I met you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even after all the work that I had done in the South, even after all the history that I learned about, there are three accounts of, history for the Republic of Texas. There's three ways that they saw that, even after all the work that I did in Arkansas and unpacking Central High and the Little Rock Nine, even after all that work, I came to Fuller Seminary 6 years ago, and it was my blessed brother, my white co-pastor Bobby, who was also a student there, who said, "You should take some classes in the Central Latino." And I said, "Why would I do that?" And he said,
Mm-hmm.
"Because they're Latino and Latina professors, and the textbooks are different, and the reading list will be different, and you speak Spanish, and you should." And I was like, later, I found out that my unconscious bias was, I don't want to do that unless I know that's going to be a good program. Do you hear the
Yeah.
implicit bias? That
Yep.
I
Yep. Yep.
immediately thought that if I went to the Spanish speaking only classes with the Latino
Mm-hmm.
professors who you and I know are amazing because we've heard them,
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
And I, even then, and it was my white brother who continues to become more and more awake. Of course, no one knows this until someone else tells you. It was my white brother who said, Inez, if you're not careful, you're going to take all class. It's very easy at Fuller to take all classes by white professors and white theologians if you're not careful. So you have to be intentional. And so because of that, I went and I got special permission to be sure that they knew I could take Spanish. And I took a third of my MDiv classes in Spanish. And I would have missed out on reclaiming my theology, reclaiming my roots, reclaiming the richness of what the Brown Church brings through all those amazing professors and through the textbooks that were different than the English dominant books, because I didn't even realize that it was an option for me. But even when Bobby told me, I was like, why would I do that? Because I thought it might be a lesser education. You see what I'm saying? This was just 6 years ago, sister. And so
Yes, I hear you.
to unlearn with compassion and to go, oh my gosh, look at, it's there again. I have to unlearn and I have to relearn. And we have to constantly listen to our bodies, listen to ourselves, listen to each other, to the collective that's saying, hey, brown is good too. Brown is a means of grace. And my people need your people. And your people, Dia, need my people. And there's that reciprocity. It's whiteness that has lied to us, that has told us we are less than, that our bodies are less than. And that's a grave injustice, to think that some bodies are less than others. That's something that whiteness has lied to us about. So I'm still learning. I'm still having to unlearn and relearn. And I do so by trying to keep nourishing those roots. My ancestors, they want to talk to us. Our ancestors, they want to talk to us. Wakanda, she wants to talk to us.
So much to share. All that collective wisdom. Can't imagine it going to waste simply because we don't have the capacity to hear anymore, right? Like, how terrible would that be? All of that collectively gained wisdom from our ancestors. This bit about Fuller, what I want to pinpoint there is this intentionality, because it is very, very easy to fall into the flow of like this undercurrent, because the system is quite large and it's not anyone's fault. I'm trying to, like, I don't know why, maybe just there's a reason for that, but it's not anyone's fault that you find yourself within this current necessarily. You can't just point it to one person and say, like, it's you. We're in a system, like a movement, a current, if you will. And so there's always a need to develop the muscle of intentionality, of seeking out the other story, seeking out one's own story as well. You have to constantly do it, because the thing with racism, specifically systemic racism, is it follows this cyclical pattern. We just came out of 2020 and the protests and the uprisings and all of that. But if you look around, very slowly, even though we're seeing like more diverse campaigns and like fashion and things like that, the media, marketing, all that. If you look at the collective sort of conversation, there's this very slow turn where it seems as though all is well in the world, and we don't need to bring up that race thing again. It happens all the time, and then slowly but surely you start to see these little incidents pop up, and people begin to speak out until we hit this boiling point, big eruption. And then again, you start the cycle, right? And so there's this sort of need to keep the muscle of intentionality and seeing the fullness of the story as much as possible. One thing, because we're close to time and wrapping up, but we're over time, but I want to mention this because you've said it a couple of times, and I think it's important. You said it first when you spoke about listening to America on the EP. You said that things were coming up for you and your body. And then you've spoken a couple of times about needing to check in with your body, needing to understand like what's happening within your body. And even throughout this conversation, I have been noting like what my body is doing. When I hear you talk about your ancestry and your ancestors and the land that you come from and your story in general, I feel this sense of warmth and expansion and openness in my body. As soon as we begin to talk about whiteness and racism, I feel it sort of clenching, And I just want to note this because I think what's key here is that the journey is not only intellectual, but our bodies, they remember so much. You know, we're so incredibly connected to land and ancestry through our physical beings. And if we have the capacity to tune in to that, also there within lie our ancestors, you know. So just on our final words and final thought, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how your body has taught you along this journey of discovering the beauty of Inez, you know, as Inez is in her fullness.
Thank you for pausing there and giving space for our bodies, because we don't live disembodied theologies, and we're not
Mm-hmm.
disembodied beings. And so one way that I've learned to reclaim my body and how it's trying to talk to me, she's trying to talk to me, and my ancestors are trying to talk to me as well, is by asking myself, when I feel a discomfort, like just right now, like you're saying, when you start feeling the tension, I ask, where do I feel that in my body? I often
Mm-hmm.
feel in my womb, which you know that I speak.
Mm-hmm.
I speak womb.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
in
Oh,
my
I love that
womb, I
phrase.
will feel I will feel the anger, or I'll feel grief or lament
Mm-hmm.
or joy. Or when I preach from my womb. And so
Mm-hmm.
needing to be
Yes, you do.
attentive to where I see it and feel it in my womb, I'll say, where did I feel that in my body? It's usually the womb, but sometimes it's my chest too. Like my heart will hurt about something, and I'll feel like I can't breathe. And then
Mm-hmm.
the second question that I ask myself is, what am I feeling? What's the feeling connected to where I'm feeling it? Because trauma theory has taught us that when we're in a survival mode, when we're experiencing direct trauma, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
microaggressions or macroaggressions, we don't have the capacity in real life, in real time, to have we don't have access to language to express what's happening. So the language is our body. Our body's trying to tell us
Mm-hmm.
something. So where do I feel it in my body? And then what am I feeling? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Am I afraid? Um, I was in a meeting just last week where I started sweating,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt like my throat was closing up because of what I was hearing. And it took me
Mm-hmm.
hours to realize that I was feeling overt oppression in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to ask myself, what am I feeling? And then what is the memory that stands out and
Yes.
that is connected to
Yes.
that? But for that, it
Yes.
requires intentionality. It requires attentiveness to our bodies. It requires that we welcome our emotions without judgment, because they're trying to tell us something. And again,
Yes.
through trauma theory, you know that you have access to language later, after the fact, to what has just
Yes.
happened. So you have to pause and go back and to ask, what was that about? What did I feel? How did that make me feel? What was that?
Mm-hmm.
Was that perceived? Was it imagined? Am I having a PTSD moment? I think I had a PTSD moment, and that's why I felt like my throat was closing up,
Mm-hmm.
like somebody was
Mm-hmm.
choking me. And so I have had to learn to be more attentive to my body and to know that she is trying to talk to me, and her
Mm-hmm.
experience is also valid. And that I
Mm-hmm.
bring in not just my current experience, but through my very layperson understanding of epigenetics, and learning that if trauma is passed down,
It's really good.
then also
Mm-hmm.
healing can be passed down. And so,
Amen.
in order for me to heal, I need to also be very aware to the trauma that has been passed down through my body. And so,
Yes.
when I hurt,
Yes.
I'm also listening to another indigenous or another immigrant person hurting
Yes.
in me and through me and
Yes.
through
Yes.
that lineage.
Yes.
And when you are more aware to your own internalized oppression, I'm able to listen to yours. So it gives
Mm-hmm.
me more compassion. So a few years ago, when I went to Manzanar, the Japanese American concentration camp here in California, I was in line of all places to go to the bathroom, and a sister was standing in front of me, and she happens to be African American. I don't remember her name because she was from another church, but I was just chatting, and I said, what are you going to buy at the gift shop? And she said, oh, I'm going to buy one of the poster of the executive order. And I said, why do you want to buy that? And she said, because I want to read what the language said, so that if ever this happens again in history, I'll be able to catch it, because oppression has a certain rhyme and a certain way of
Mm-hmm.
speaking. And
Yeah.
sure enough, a few years later, we were listening to executive orders in this country being sent out that were keeping people, anti-Asian hate, anti-Muslim hate. And I remember that conversation in the bathroom as she and I were standing in line because so I want to paint that picture. Here's an African-American sister who knows her oppression really well, wanting to hear the echo of the oppression in her Japanese sibling community so that if it happens again, she'll be able to pick it up in her body. But in order to do that, we have to be intentional about learning the history. So going back to listen to our bodies, because when we feel uncomfortable, especially in a public place, when a micro or macroaggression happens, sometimes we don't have immediate language to know that something wrong is happening, but our bodies feel it. We get sweaty, clammy hands. We are anxious. We can't breathe very well because we're experiencing something that's unjust. And so now I'm trying to get ahead of the curve and go, if I feel this way again, I have to speak up. I have to call the police, or I have to put my body in front of somebody else's body to protect them, whatever it is. But we must be attentive to what our bodies are telling us, because our bodies are also a land and a landscape that come with a history. So thank you for pausing and being attentive to our bodies there, because there's healing there and there's opportunity there.
It's so good. I love Rupi. I hope I get her last name right, but Rupi Kaur's book, Home Body. She talks about the body as home, and I love bringing these two elements that we've been talking about, homemaking and the body together. In the sense that my body is also home, needs care, and it's really just learning the body's language. It is actually speaking constantly, and just understanding how to decipher it in a way that is useful and helpful. I want to keep chatting, but Inés,
I'm so glad for what rose up in our bodies and words through our mouths.
100%. I'm so grateful for you. I knew the conversation would be rich, but I always just leave your presence feeling as though I have tapped into another layer of the world, and another layer of the spirit of God. I always say that there's no end to God. There's always something new to discover. And that is how I feel when I'm in your presence, And so I do want to say thank you for being the homemaker that you are, not just in a maternal sense, but I just mean as your essence, as your person, because I have personally benefited from it. Entering into your presence is quite a beautiful gift, and so I'm so grateful for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dia, for being the magnificent person that you are, because you too house the presence of God. And I say this personally, but also for the collective, that we need the poets and the artists and the creatives like you to give our ideas and our sense of belonging and identity, to give them a voice, to give them a color, to give them texture. This is what I loved so much about your exhibit, that you brought, textiles that came with a history, and we could touch them and we could hear them and we could see them. And you do that with whatever medium you have in front of you. And we need you, because you're co-creating with the spirit and reimagining something new than what has been handed down to us. So thank you as a poet and as an artist and as a creative for the work of God that you are doing for the collective.
Thank you so much. We need you as well, and all of your many beautiful ways. Thank you.